The half-dark office on the embankment smells of wet wool and old wax. On the table, there are bundles of keys, bags with seals, and lists, where opposite each house is neatly written out to whom it belongs and what debts the moneylender has recorded. Men in cloaks walk through the courtyard, and you can hear chests slamming shut. Dawn is still a long way off, but the papers are already waiting for their owners. Some will be taken away to the casemate. Others will be given an inventory. Others will be stamped, sealed for the sake of faith. It's cold inside, which makes any scratch on the tabletop seem like a deep scar. Where they usually count rent and grain, they now count other people's lives, who owned what before the night, and what it will be called afterward. Dear viewers, I salute you. Right where you're watching from, and whether you've encountered stories where salacious rumors suddenly turn out to be a convenient screen for property seizures. Share in the comments. It helps to see the bigger picture. Enjoy the listen. We'll look at how the court of a king, known for his steady hand and love of clear records, built an operation against a military order whose houses and chests covered the map of Europe as thickly as market stalls cover a square. In myth, it was a sacred purification of secret vices. On paper, it was a fiscal-political combination where kissing the statute and other hints acted as a smokescreen, and the real objectives were read in treasury statements and confiscation inventories. To understand why the rumors erupted then, one must see the background. The royal court was used to living on the edge. Wars with foreign crowns and unruly counties ate up the treasury faster than the mints could produce new cups of silver. One season, they changed the alloy content, trying to stretch stocks. The next, they pulled credits, hoping for future levies. Crown collectors counted how much salt brought in, how much the bridge, where tolls were taken at the crossing, how much wine excise taxes, how much fines. Other people's property lays easily into these records, especially if it is gathered like a net. Houses at the crossroads, yards by the wharves, warehouses that smell of roasted grain and tar, all belong to men in white cloaks with red crosses, adult knights and serving brothers who held not only a sword but also a book of accounts. They were called the poor knights of the temple, but poverty was about rules and dress, not bookkeeping. The order held deposits, transferred money, fed garrisons, insured caravans, and held the keys to the coffers of many noble houses. It was this branching out that made them a convenient target. When the court realized that another war and failure in collections had driven the treasury into a void, 2 maps were laid on the king's desk. One was a map of debts and stale bills of exchange. The other was a map of the order's holdings. On the second, everything looked smooth and clear. Houses, yards, rents, mills, vineyards, inns. There was only one thing missing: access to these chests without a reason that sounded louder than the thirst for income. The reason was found in rumors. The market loves a whisper, and whispers love other people's secrets. There were indeed rituals of acceptance in the order, where obedience and loyalty were tested. Somewhere, the ritual forms were written down dryly and briefly. Somewhere they were recounted from memory and peppered with innuendo. This was enough to make the city's courtyards abuzz with talk of secret rites, insulting the sacred, and obscenities that are impossible to look at, but pleasant to retell. These words work like smoke. People are drawn to the spectacle, and the treasury gets a reason to act. The arrests began early, on the same morning in different cities. Lists were prepared in advance, seals too. Where the guards took a house, scribes entered from the threshold and tabulated other people's lives. In one column, keys and seals; in another, scrolls for possessions; in a third, books of accounts; in a fourth, other items. People were sent to the guardhouse, and papers were sent to the chancery, where a different order awaited them. In the first protocols, The confessions sounded as if they had been copied from a template. The same distribution of phrases, the same sequence of fall and repentance. This does not sound like live speech. It sounds like a matrix that a scribe fits into a frame. The method of extracting such confessions was known to the era and left a heavy mark on the bodies of grown men. Torture as an authorized procedure was present in the toolkit of the manhunt, and we record it as a social fact without scenes. Where confessions were collected quickly, the formulas were repeated to the comma, and this is especially noticeable against the difference in local writing habits. The louder the obscene accusations were made, the neater the inventory of property grew. Treasury statements recorded yards, ladders, salt warehouses, bridge concessions, vineyard rents, debt notes, and other people's deposits. The treasury, accustomed to dilapidated figures, was suddenly getting hold of coherent assets with clear flows. Where the order held the money changers, the crown got leverage to milk debtors. Where the order held marketplaces, the council could rearrange the collectors. Political logic shines transparently through religious formulas. Any man of the court knows the value of the word purification when it tails off to the stacking of coffers in the treasury. The crowd demanded a spectacle, and some of the town squares were buzzing like before the fire. Rumors need blood, and people looking at the closed doors of the temple houses imagined mysteries they had never seen. But the town statutes, especially where the trade guilds held council, had time to insert slingshots against bodily evidence, forbidden in public. The doctor at the town hall and midwives played a different role in these cases. They wrote the description of condition that the law forbade to be taken in evidence. This did not always stop the zeal, but it sobered up the procedure and brought the conversation back to lists and seals. Even when a wanted man brought confessions under pain, the scribe was obliged to attach an inventory at the bottom of the page, and the more thorough the inventories were, the clearer it became that the loud moral rhetoric was covering up a simple administrative operation to change ownership. During this period, the court worked with two hands, religious and financial. On the one hand, the theme of insulted sanctities was hyped so that the skinny moralists would become allies of the fisc. On the other hand, drew up roadmaps to convert the order's assets for the use of the crown, where it direct appropriation, where it the transfer of trusted people, where it the replacement of key persons. On paper, it looked like a sequence of legal actions, but they all found justification in the noise of the crowd. The crude word forfeiture was replaced by the euphony of purge, and where city statutes demanded evidence, rustled confessions were placed on the table, in identical wording, arranged so that the judge was left with a semblance of foundation. Even those who favored tacit loyalty couldn't help but see the difference between how words changed overnight and how quickly the chests rolled outward. This does not invalidate the real religious conflicts of the era, nor does it negate the fact that abuses of power were found wherever people were taken for the cause. We mark it dryly: incarceration, pressure, humiliation, as social damage that battered the health and honor of grown men. But it is this very dryness that helps respect the document. Where the process had to look for facts, it settled for formulas, and where evidence was needed, it was replaced by stories about mysteries. This substitution is especially evident when one juxtaposes two sets of papers, the confession and the inventory. The former is monotonous, the latter rich and detailed. The former takes effect immediately, the latter yields income for a long time. The second wave of withholdings was prepared with a pedantry worthy of a mint. Secret lists compiled by the people of the royal chancery, spread across the Bialiajami and Seneschalstva, and at dawn at the same hour, the doors of the order's houses were opened with crowbars instead of keys. In the chronicles of different cities, this date converges like notches on a pole. The 13th of October, 1307th year. The adult brothers were awakened by the boots of the guards, and downstairs, in the refectory, sandpits for sprinkling ink were already set up, and registers were laid out. From that morning on, the myth of secret indecency finally became the fuel for the inventory machine, and every protocol exhibited the same mechanics. Confessions with a formulaic sequence of sins, then a cold list of property, from horses to millwrights. Where testimony was lacking, a body of evidence appeared, and where evidence was needed, it was replaced by opaque formulas. The difference between paper rhetoric and tangible benefits was not even attempted to hide. Chests went to the treasury, account books to the treasurer's desk, keys to bundles marked with the new owner's wax. The king's need for money was no secret even to those who could not read. Changing the proof of coin, delayed payments to garrisons, and complaints from towns about extraordinary levies all went to the forefront. The order by this time owned not only the courts and fields, but also the credit of the crown. Its letters, by which correspondence was carried on between fairs, made large transfers possible without risk to cash. It was for this reason that in the same packet with the creedal sheets in the chancery lay debt receipts, mortgage notes, and correspondence with moneylenders. There, one could clearly see the nerve of the operation. Confiscation, as a way of zeroing out the liabilities and hijacking the financial net, cloaked in religious rather than market language. This does not undo the religious zeal of the era, nor does it remove the gravity of the abuses of power that accompanied the interrogation of adult men. We record it dryly as social damage, reread the doctor's notes describing exhaustion and trauma, and realize the price of formulaic repentances that do not match the handwriting of live speech. In towns with strong merchant self-government, they tried to pull the process in a legal direction. Where guild charters and community statutes had time to prohibit humiliating bodily evidence, every demand for cleansing rested on a board with an engraved list, witnesses to the fact, the thing, the place, the hour. The doctor at the town hall and the midwives left the noteworthy part as a description of a condition that could not serve as evidence. The crowd demanded spectacle, but the town order, learned from trade conflicts, responded by spreading keys, seals, and scrolls on the table. This gap between moralistic clamor and inventory coldness is especially evident in the minutes, where the same confessions are followed by the richest list of assets: salt warehouses, inns on the big roads, vineyards, the right to collect bridge tolls, shares in fair revenues. The treasury was filling up like a burst cistern, but the paper persistently called it purification. The papal curia at this time kept on a thin line. On the one hand, the order was subject to the See of the Apostles, and therefore any hasty destruction of it without ecclesiastical procedure threatened the authority of the Holy See. On the other, the strength of royal authority and the support of the cities, tired of alien property autonomy within their walls, demanded a compromise. Commissions created for the proceedings asked for confirmation of heretical rites, and every time faced with the obliquity of the evidence. Confessions extracted under duress, reduced to the same wording. Witnesses to the fact disappeared. Objects allegedly serving the insult not shown. Against this background, the weight of inventories grew. They were accurate, dated, certified by local notaries, and it was they, not purification rituals, that brought visible effect. If myth required blood and a public stage, a document required neat sums and seals, and it was the document that won. Financial logic did the rest. Confiscated houses quickly found new holders: royal agents, loyal vassals, city corporations. Debts to the order were written off or reshaped under new terms. Networks of cash redistribution and deposits came under the control of the crown's men or allied banking houses. From the inside, it looked like the twitching cardiogram rhythm of the city. Where yesterday a white shroud stood at the gate, today a treasury table with new tariffs hangs. Where yesterday order brothers were on duty, today a royal sergeant stands. The crowd, which had recently demanded signs of purification, quickly switched to complaints about the price of salt or new taxes, which means that the goal of the operation was achieved. The noise was transferred to another register, in which the palace has more levers. The state machine, once it has executed a major seizure, begins to calibrate the consequences. The scandal around the interrogations has left a trace. Too many identical confessions, too many complaints about pressure, too clear a dependence of the result on a technique that is not tested by the thing. To close this vulnerability, legal usage slowly reinforced the norms we encountered in the city's statutes. Restrictions on bodily evidence, strict conditions for allowing torture only under strong suspicion, and with court authorization, the priority of material evidence over moral totality of the indicia. The clerk's offices recorded this dully and precisely, by enumerating the conditions under which a description of an adult's condition is only a medical document and not the key to a verdict, by reminding us that without an object and two witnesses to the fact, the trial should not move toward punishment. The impact of these formulas on the future cannot be overestimated. Where the body ceases to be attributed the power of proof, myth is deprived of a platform. The operation against the order became the subject of table retellings in which kissing the statute and other ceremonial innuendos grew to the size of the main cause. But the even handwriting of the inventory books silently proves the contrary. There are no passions in these books. Their numbers and things are translated into the language of property rights. They show the root, an empty treasury, a convenient network of assets, noise as justification. Individual cities tried to adjust the process to legality as much as the fear of the throne allowed. Local notarial acts were demanded. Seals were checked. No purges were allowed in the public square. This did not save those who were taken, for example, and whose confessions gained the necessary weight, but it slowed down the transformation of the case into a bazaar. The future shift was born on this edge. If confiscation could not be stopped, at least the most dangerous support of confiscation, the bodily demonstration as evidence, could be ousted from the practice. Reading through the layers, it's easy to see how myth became a serving piece rather than the main course. Rumors, like a spicy sauce. Confessions, like a disposable plate. The treasury, like a knife and fork used for their intended purpose. Cold domestic detail holds this perspective better than any rhetoric. The property lists have mills next to houses. The mills have bridges. The bridges have the right to tolls, and the new holder is marked at the bottom. Thus, sacred purification becomes an accounting act, and obscenity becomes a working fog to cover the shuffling of keys. In the next section, we shall go deeper into the laboratory of confessions, where truth was molded out of identical formulas, and see how exactly the place and the charter of the city sometimes broke the course of the trial, moving it from the hot air of the square to the cold table of the court, where a seal is valued more than a whisper, and a doctor's note is no substitute for evidence. The interrogation rooms were arranged in the same way, as if they had been assembled according to the same instructions. A low table, a sand pit for sprinkling ink, a pitcher of water, a bench for the scribe, 2 guards, on the wall a crucifix and a table with a prayer. By the door, a chest for things, where the belts, knives, and buckles of the detainees were placed. Here, confessions were born, resembling each other, like impressions of the same mold. The scribe began with the questionnaire part, noted the age and status of an adult male belonging to the order, then put on paper the sequence of fall and repentance, leaving gaps in the right places, which were filled in with the very formulas for which everything was started. The doctor's note on the back reported weakness, signs of compression, and the fact that the ward was incapable of prolonged conversation. No midwives were involved, and that in itself was important. The description of condition was a medical part, not evidence. When one confession coincides with another to the comma, it is not a confession but a pattern, and these coincidences multiplied from interrogation to interrogation, as if one iron ruler were lying on all the tables at once. This mechanics is seen in the comparison of different places. In some bailages, it was written in Latin formulas, in others in vernacular, but everywhere the same steps were repeated. The protocols recorded that a detained adult brother knew of the secret of the statute, bent to wrong words, participated in the ritual, and then repented and asked for purification. The only difference was how diligently this latter was rewritten. There were notes in the margins about pains, fevers, falls of consciousness, and in the same days, in the same towns, chancery offices were binding inventories of property with particular diligence, lists of house keys, land registers with boundaries, records of rents and letters of indebtedness. These are not theories. They are parallel lines of paper that cannot help but be seen when laid side by side. Where the sin was dispersed so that there was enough of it for the whole room, the thing did not need to be dispersed. It was at hand, stamped and witnessed. Papal commissioners arriving to deal with the thing were confronted with this double scenery and tried to make it talk. In one city, they demanded witnesses to a fact, but received only people who had heard rumors. In another, they asked for objects and came up empty. Nothing of the offending was produced, but stenciled words. Where one tried to check the handwriting of confessions against that of the signer, one found the hand of the scribe, not the detainee. Where one asked for a list of ritual instruments, one saw only new seals on other people's chests. The gap was accumulating cold irritation, even among those who sympathized with royal necessity. Too obvious was the utilitarian directness, from empty coffers to confiscated assets, and too convenient did the rhetoric of purification seem like smoke. Reports to the Curia were careful to note the inconsistency. The increasing religious clamor was accompanied by a systematic transfer of property rights. Meanwhile, in towns accustomed to counting rather than taking their word for it, the statutes took over. The town hall boards, on which were embossed the articles on witnesses, the hour, and the place, worked as shields against courtroom spectacle. Whenever a messenger came with a demand to cleanse the city of the contagion, the guild elders would ask about 2 adult witnesses to the fact and the object, a scroll, a key, a book. If only verbal secrets and obscenities were recognized, the process was finished on the spot, translating it into accounting. How much it costs to seal a house, who pays the guard, how much the market loses on a closed shop. A crowd demanding spectacle hates numbers, and the treasury does not live without numbers. And it was in this boring zone that the purification was losing fire. The doctor, at the behest of the council, was increasingly attaching a formula that had been found in city files before. A description of an adult's condition is not proof, not evidence. This dry line, smelling of band-aids and vinegar, took away the square's right to look into bodies like purses. In the confession laboratory, meanwhile, new possibilities of pressure were being worked out. Isolation, sleep deprivation, frightening, spreading the example around the neighboring houses. We record this without detail, as social damage inflicted on adult men sanctioned by the authorities. This damage was argued against not in words, but in procedure. Where the statute required strong suspicion, torture could be used only by order of a judge, and not for the sake of the torture itself, but for the sake of finding things. If things were not found, the confession fell like a rung without a wall. This confession-thing linkage broke down in royal cases all too often, and this was most clearly seen by the notaries who also signed the confiscation inventories. Their signatures stood under lists of mills, bridge tolls, vineyards, salt warehouses. Next to each object was a note of the new holder, the same handwriting in the same books at the same time. In a sense, even the language of the market square worked against the legend. Where resellers discussed obscenities, the price tags for salt, grain, and wine were already being rewritten by a new scribe because the order's trade network had changed hands. Life was quickly giving away political arithmetic. Before the crowd had negotiated signs, the boatmen were already paying tolls to the king's sergeant instead of the brother in the cloak. Before the scribe had finished another penitence formula, the town collector was recalculating the revenues from the fair, half of which had been put in the contribution of the order column just yesterday. In this way, the smoke was losing strength. It was still enough to justify the arrests and the first bonfires, but beyond that, it was not emotion that worked, but the network. Who kept the warehouse? Who collected the money? Who signed the invoices? This practical layer does not negate the fact that the faithful had their own reasons to hate the independence of the order. Foreign jurisdiction within the city walls, people removed from local courts, immunities that irritated the authorities. But even here, the document was more sobering than the sermon. When the Curia conducted the process, it encountered unsubstantiated voids and had to divorce its hands. Some decisions had to be recognized out of political fear, others had to be softened, and others had to be justified in order to save face. The result was a chain of compromises. Somewhere, the houses of order were transferred to another spiritual institution. Somewhere, the crown, somewhere, the city, and somewhere, a private holder under the control of the treasury. The destruction of the unified grid was enough to remove the acuteness of the threat. The myth has worked out, further ruled the inventory. On the other flank, in universities and law schools, the story was seen as an excuse to reinforce the method. Teachers explicitly conflated fresh scandals with long-standing rules of evidence. A confession unsupported by things and two witnesses is mere sound. A body of evidence is a dangerous laziness of thought. Bodily testing is a path to the abyss where shame replaces evidence. These theses, chiseled in classrooms and carried into city bylaws, become visible in the paper of the following decades. More and more articles where torture is allowed only under strong suspicion and with court authorization. More and more reminders that description of condition is a medical record, not evidence. More and more fines for slander, presented as moral zeal. And though the shadow of the royal blow to the order lay on the ground for a long time to come, the mechanism for enforcing shame as a street began to creak. It is not necessary to construct a perfect picture. There were cities where the mob got theirs: bonfires, penances, purification processions, the humiliation of grown men brought out on display. There were officials for whom inventorying other people's property became a career. There were judges who turned a blind eye to empty counts of evidence for fear of the throne. These stains cannot be erased, but if you look at the line rather than the flashes, you can see how out of the very practice itself a counterbalance was born. Where men of commerce and law managed to impose procedure, the myth lost its pivot, and the smoke settled into a wall of boards with engraved articles. And it was this experience of how flesh and shame were taken away from the public square and returned to the medical and legal sphere that would later turn into reforms that would say in plain text, the adult body is not evidence. Torture is not the way to the truth. Repentance without a thing is not a verdict. Meanwhile, the royal machine was finishing what it had started for. The assets of the order's network, scattered across the provinces, were being assembled under new seals and names. Bridge tolls gave way to monetary experiments, where they changed the sample and exchange rate to cover the costs of war in the palace. In the same place came the deposit obligations, from which the old seals were removed, and new ones, more convenient to the fiscus, were appropriated. The treasury books recorded that revenues after the purge were more stable than in the season before it, a sign that the economic goal had been achieved. The subject of obscene rites was returned to less and less often. The crowd's interest had died out, and the theologian's argument moved to the auditorium. There, they compared the correctness of a political move with the damage to the legal fabric and the risk to the authority of the throne. Two loud lies do not serve long-lasting power well. The third season after the decisive blow brought an important, though muted, result: the enshrinement in statutes of rules that had seemed superfluous a few years earlier. The new editions of the community statutes came forward with formulae about the priority of things and witnesses over the totality of signs, about the necessity of written authorization for hard means, about the inadmissibility of public bodily trials on grounds of faith, about the status of the medical record as a purely health document. This prose, dull as anything written for longevity, was a direct consequence of a high-profile case. The system had learned its lesson. When shame and the body are turned into a legal tool, the body ceases to belong to the person, and the process dies as a search for truth. The correction came not from moralizing, but from fear of repeating the managerial conflagration in which confidence in the court and in the press is quickly extinguished. Packets of protocols flocked to the papal commissions, and the further in, the more marked became the discrepancy between the bitter formulas of confessions and the businesslike density of the inventories. The commissioners demanded the thing, the place, the hour, and 2 witnesses to the fact, and received identical letters of fall and remorse written by the hands of scribes. City charters pushed the process to things: keys, seals, rents, bridge tolls, warehouse books. Where purification of the body was demanded, the council invoked the article against humiliating tests and the doctor's caveat: a description of an adult's condition is not evidence. The crowd murmured, but the market brought the conversation back to salt tariffs, guard fees, and tamped-down sealing costs. On this cold table, the myth was losing its footing. Meanwhile, the treasury, having obtained assets, was rebuilding the money stream. Bills of exchange were being rewritten, fees were stabilizing, and the rhetoric of the holy cause was fading like soot on a lamp. Paper straightened the nerve of history. A confession without a thing is sound, a thing without witnesses is a risk, and confiscation without law is a brief victory with a long shadow. The finale took shape out of careful corrections. University lectures and city charter revisions enshrined the priority of substantive evidence and witnesses over the totality of the evidence, limited the admission of hard means to the judgment of the court, and abolished public bodily inspections as false evidence. The clerk's offices sounded dry. A doctor's record is a document of care, not a clepsydra of guilt. A confession not corroborated by things and time is mere ink. So the clamor about secret rites shrank to a footnote, and the thick books remained the main thing: inventories of houses, bridges, mills, rents, and new names of holders. The human outcome is clear, too. Grown men broken by pressure got late rehabilitations rarely, but towns learned the price of procedure and hid the body from the public square. The myth of the sacred purification remained a showcase. The document revealed the mechanism, a fiscal political operation, after which the right to a thing became heavier than a scream and the seal more important than smoke.